Hi, I'm Joe Nadglowski, President and CEO of the Obesity Action Coalition, and welcome to OAC Health Talks. Today we will discuss an important patient safety issue. Medications are used every day by people with obesity to treat conditions unrelated to weight, like depression, infections, and even cancer. People with obesity deserve to know if the medications they use are safe and effective for them, but right now, there is no requirement that drugs specifically be tested in people with obesity prior to approval, putting them at unnecessary risk for poorer health outcomes. We asked Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford to speak on this issue. Dr. Stanford is an obesity medicine physician scientist, educator, and policymaker at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, who bridges the intersection of medicine, public health, policy, and disparities. Here's Dr. Stanford.
So a really important question that people like to ask me, particularly as a physician scientist, are what are clinical trials? Like, what are these? Why are they important? Clinical trials are important because these are studies that are typically performed to investigate questions surrounding different thought processes. Particularly in obesity, we're often trying to understand whether particularly a lifestyle modification or whether a drug is superior to a placebo. And a placebo may be whatever the standard of care may be. So for example, we might be using a medication to compare to something like a lifestyle modification. What is just a dietary modification, looking at changing and just looking at improving one's diet compared to improving one's diet plus the addition of a medication to one's regimen, which one is superior to another? We have to use a trial to investigate the difference between the two groups. So what would happen is we would enroll two groups of individuals. One group that is on the investigative agent versus one group that is on the standard of care or the placebo group. And over time, we would investigate the differences between those two groups. And between those two groups, we would be able to see whether or not there was a difference in the outcomes of those two interventions. And that is what a clinical trial is. It gives the scientist a way of investigating the response to that individual investigative therapy, that treatment, a trial. It allows for randomization. Now that's a fancy word. That means that we don't assign an individual. A person is randomized to one group versus another group. The investigative group, that may be group A, versus the group that doesn't get that treatment, group B. And that is what a clinical trial is. It's very simple to understand, but it get complex, particularly as we're trying to think about who gets the treatment versus who gets the standard of care or the what was considered the status quo. That is what a clinical trial is. It helps us to understand a response to a therapeutic intervention to whatever we're studying at a given time. Now, it's very important for us to include individuals with obesity in therapies, and particularly in clinical trials. And I want to point out a few key times when this was very, very important. Let's look at, for example, COVID-19. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw different vaccines being tested on large-scale communities in a population where we were seeking to determine what was the likelihood of this vaccine improving one's ability to protect against a disease process that was affecting all of us, regardless of whether or not we had obesity or had obesity. But how are we going to test the efficacy, the ability for this vaccine to work in communities if we weren't testing it in a community that was disproportionately impacted by this disease process? The community that had obesity. It's as if you were testing this in individuals like myself, a community that happens to be a descendant of the enslaved, the Black community, without ever testing it in Black people. We have to make sure that we are testing these things within the community that it belongs to. We know that persons with obesity represent a large percentage of the population. we make sure that we test individuals by which we want to make sure that we are going to utilize these therapies. Why not consider the communities that these medications or therapies will be utilized? Representation matters. We need to test these individual therapies in individuals with obesity. The patients with obesity would matter. And so we need to make sure that we're testing them in individuals with obesity. It's only the right thing to do. Now, one of the key things that we have to think about when we look at the efficacy of medications in individuals that have obesity is whether or not these medications have therapeutic benefit or reach therapeutic potential in individuals with obesity. So let's look at what some of these issues might be. For example, do these medications reach therapeutic potential? Do they stay in the body too long? Or do they stay in the body long enough? These are things that we have to think about. But do we ever know this if we haven't really tested them in the patient population that they represent? In patients with obesity, we may run into issues with medications that, for example, are utilized for antipsychotic medications, medications that are antidepressant agents, medications that are across the spectrum of disease, where we haven't really thought about whether or not these medications are reaching therapeutic potential or maybe are causing issues where they have too much longevity within the body. And so we need to be really thinking about these issues. And I think that often investigators have not been thoughtful about what's happening with regards to the therapeutic benefit and potential within populations, regardless of body size and body type. And this is something that we really need to bring to that community's attention that's conducting investigative trials within populations across the spectrum of size. This is something that I always bring to the attention of my key investigators, regardless of disease spectrum, to make sure that they're being thoughtful as we recognize that more and more of the population that we're dealing with have obesity, and we want to make sure that they're being included within the discussions, regardless of whatever disease pathology is being recognized. When we think about inclusivity in clinical trials, we have to think about the full spectrum of individuals that could benefit from inclusion in clinical trials. We know here in the United States that we've grappled with this issue of making sure that certain groups have unfortunately not been included. We first faced that with racial and ethnic minority communities. We've dealt with issues like the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks. And these issues have then moved into this issue of disproportionately not including persons of size. Now, what we haven't recognized that this then continues to affect racial and ethnic minority populations, which disproportionately are impacted by this disease of obesity. Now, this is something that we have to be thoughtful of. We can't just not include large portions of the population when we're thinking about how do we use and conduct clinical trials in individuals. When I recommend medications to individuals or therapies to individuals, I want to make sure that I'm recommending medications and therapies based upon testing that reflects the full population, the full spectrum of the population. I am an obesity medicine physician, which means I exclusively care for patients with obesity. How can I, in my heart of hearts, recommend therapies that have not been tested in the patients that I care for? It would be a travesty for me to recommend therapies that do not reflect the patients that I have dedicated my life to caring for. And I think it's of utmost importance that we make sure that we dedicate our lives to caring for every single person, because all people, regardless of their size, should be included, should be uplifted, should be investigated to the full potential. All persons, regardless of size, matter. All persons should be included within these clinical trials. I've dedicated my life to the care of patients with obesity, and my patients do matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stanford, for your insight. Now I'd like to introduce a video showing real-world examples of how this issue affects patients. Please note that portions of this video do not use people first language. At OAC, we champion the use of people first language to put the person before their disease. While we still have work to do here, this video is critical to understanding the issue at hand.
How would you feel if you found out your medication was ineffective? And it was ineffective because it was never even tested to treat somebody like you.
To know that a drug is not going to work because of how heavy I am. If you're 300 pounds, it's not going to work for you. But not tell you that when they give it to you. It was like, I'm just a guinea pig.
What I found just as an overweight person for the last 25 years as an adult is doctors, you're either invisible or the answer is to lose weight, even with mental health.
Obesity in the United States has quadrupled in the last 50 years, to the point where 42% of Americans are now living with obesity. And it's projected that half of Americans will have obesity by the year 2030. However, despite being a high percentage of the population, patients with obesity are often excluded from clinical drug trials when approving a new medication. And there's currently nothing forcing this to change, as FDA Commissioner Robert Califf observed.
There are generally no FDA regulatory requirements at present to evaluate weight as a specific issue. Consequently, they continue to be underrepresented in research and in clinical trials, making it difficult to obtain the necessary data to inform dosing of a newly marketed drug in an obese individual.
So why are people with obesity excluded from clinical trials? Well, a lot of people think they're complicated or they're hard to deal with, or maybe they have some stigma or bias towards their specific attitudes. And so it's actually neglectful when companies don't actually test their medicines in people who live with this chronic disease, people who, are put in real harm's way.
And one of the prime examples of the real harm this exclusion creates is seen in the patients who were formerly prescribed the drug Rexulti.
I was a patient on Rexulti, and it absolutely did not work for me.
My name is Jordan, and Rexulti didn't work for me.
My name's Gwen. Rexulti did not work for me.
My name is Shelly, and Rexulti didn't work for me.
My name is Shivaria, and Rexulti did not work for me.
Rexulti is a prescription medication meant to treat patients with schizophrenia and major depressive disorder, which is a patient population that is disproportionately affected by obesity.
About 60% of the people who have schizophrenia have obesity. So I think when we look at the Rexulti clinical studies, we see very clearly that the medicines were not studied in people with BMIs greater than 35. And the reality is that there's probably real consequences because those studies were not completed.
Real consequences for real people.
It didn't help with anxiety and depression. If anything, it made my anxiety and depression 10 times worse. I remember even getting to a point with depression where I was having suicidal thoughts. The anxiety was just absolutely, completely through the roof.
I knew how my body responded. They always say the patient knows themselves the best. And I knew you had to wait a certain period of time. But in 4 weeks, no, I didn't see any improvement at all. I felt like I was going backwards.
I did not find Rexulti effective at all. I was in hospital in a psychiatric unit when they started me on it. I was having very, very severe depressive episodes. It was hard to feel happy.
It's not just a few patients that found Rexulti ineffective. In a survey of over 100 patients, as BMI increased, more and more patients said Rexulti did not work for them. In fact, when you compare patients with and without obesity, the difference in effectiveness was 60%. And of course, these were patients that were not included in the Rexulti approval studies.
And specifically looking at their clinical trials, they didn't include a large population of people with obesity. And of course, that means the medicine may be less effective. And in fact, data has suggested that it is less effective in people with obesity. Therefore, if a clinical trial chose to exclude people with obesity or a portion of the people with obesity from it, it's actually not reflecting what's happening in the real world.
New research has shed light on why this is happening. Patients with obesity take a significantly longer amount of time to reach effective Rexulti levels than patients without. In fact, the research shows that patients with obesity take 60% longer to reach effective levels. What's disturbing is the same research found that patients with obesity who happen to have a certain genetic trait will never reach the effective levels. Thankfully, though, the solution is simple. Just by increasing the dose, patients with obesity will reach effective levels, just like people without.
The time necessary to reach effective drug concentrations in blood is prolonged. And the reason is that the product label, we feel, and based on the data, is not applicable to people with obesity. You need to have more drug taken at once for the first week or so of treatment in order to get to the desired range in a way that benefits the patient most. So you have to increase the dose earlier on at a faster pace. And this new plan works.
Knowing that there is a better dosing plan and that it could have been used, it could change so many lives. It could make the medication that much more effective. For people who have severe suicidal ideation, that is very important to treat the depression as quickly and as effectively as possible.
This research has been published in academic journals. It has been sent to the company that makes Rexulti. It was even presented at an FDA meeting with Commissioner Califf. Yet there has been no action. The research team even includes former FDA review division heads for psychiatry and clinical pharmacology. It is imperative that this research and improved dosing plan gets out to doctors and patients. And the way to do this is through the drug label.
For drugs that are already in the market, it's important to make sure that the labels are characterize the adequate dose, or at least speak to the need to consider obesity when establishing a therapeutic dose.
Updating these labels is key because it gives both the clinician and the patient the information they need to get the best care possible. I think specifically a Rexulti label update would make sure that people who are using this medicine are getting the effective dose.
Updating the labels is a step in the right direction. But to prevent this from happening in the future, people with obesity need to be included in clinical trials. The FDA already requires studies for certain groups of people, like those with liver disease, but they represent less than 2% of the population. So why aren't people with obesity included in approval trials when they represent 42% of the population?
That disparity represents a real bias against obesity and emphasizes the reason why people with obesity need to be included in clinical trials.
Exclusion from clinical trials is just another example of people with obesity feeling unseen, unheard, and forgotten.
To the Food and Drug Administration, please do the right thing. Encourage the manufacturers of these medicines to study them appropriately in people with obesity. We are a large percentage of the population. The reality is many medicines are used in people with obesity, and they need to be safe and effective in that population.
It's proven that obesity modifies drug therapy, and they need to revamp their mandates for drug development.
If you're only testing for a certain group of people for this medication, then you're absolutely not doing any favors for the other half of the people. Matter of fact, you're making it worse. Way worse.
Not every person fits a certain mold, and they don't fit that perfect BMI. Each person needs to have a say, and each person needs to be considered.
Please do better. Make sure that you are vetting medications, that research is done thoroughly for all populations that are going to be taking this medication. because it affects real people.
I would love for you to consider bigger bodies when you're making medications, because we are a large percentage of the U.S., and I understand that it might be uncomfortable to confront that, but also we exist, and we would love to have medications that can help us have fuller, more quality lives.
The OAC wants to give our members and viewers the opportunity to take action on this important issue, and you can do that right from home. All you need to do is head to the OAC Action Center, linked in the description. With a few clicks, you can send a pre-written letter to the FDA urging them to close the gaps in the testing and approval process for medications intended for use by people with obesity. The FDA has the power to require drug companies to test drugs on people with obesity prior to approval. Thank you for taking OAC action. We'd like to take a moment to extend our gratitude to all our donors out there. It's your support that makes OAC's programs possible and free for everyone. If you'd like to be a part of this meaningful cause and support our efforts, please make a donation today. Together, we can make a lasting impact and create a more informed and empowered community.